All right, it is 11 o'clock Central Time, so we will go ahead and get started with the third webinar in our webinar series. Today, we are going to talk about the 10 questions that we should be asking in every bid review. Just a little bit about Firestone Consulting Group. Firestone Consulting Group works with the leaders and owners in the construction industry to build businesses for the lifestyle they desire through leveraging their people and by developing a well-oiled system to operate their business. Our methods are based on real-world experience of actually running and growing contracting businesses. With years of hands-on experience, our team of advisors and consultants will help you to define your goals, develop a plan to achieve them, and help you implement the plan, and most importantly, be right there with you to celebrate your successes. I am Matt Firestone, president of Firestone Consulting Group, and like I said, welcome to the third webinar in our webinar series. See many of you getting logged in here, and looks like we have a pretty good group for the webinar today. First, I'd like to thank McCormick Systems, our sponsor. Some of you were on a previous webinar, and McCormick was our sponsor there. But real quick, McCormick Systems is the nation's leader in estimating and project management software with solutions for all sizes of contractors. Whether you're a one-man shop or you're a multi-million-dollar company, McCormick has products that will be there to help you with your estimating and project management needs. You can visit McCormick on the web at mccormicksys.com, and Todd and his team would be glad to help you get up and running with a state-of-the-art estimating system. So like we said, today we're looking at the 10 questions that we want to answer in every bid review, and really the outcomes that we have for today are, most importantly, why do we have bid reviews? And then what are the questions that we should be asking during our bid review? One thing I would like to do as we get started is real quickly do a poll and just get a feel for the group here of what you're currently doing for bid reviews. Do you have a formal process? And with that bid review process, do you actually have a checklist that you use with that bid review? So first question there, and really this is kind of what sets the tone for our whole webinar today is, it goes back to, have you ever had a job or been awarded a job and then you realize that you missed something or you forgot something from your bid? So if you would quickly answer these three questions here. But as you're doing that, as I said, a lot of times these checklists or these questions that we ask are the result of something being left out on a bid, or maybe we've been rushed and didn't have a formal bid review process. But by having this process in place, having a checklist that we can use, we'll see that it definitely helps us to eliminate some of those errors and mistakes. So we'll give it just another minute here, see a few more responses coming in. Glad everybody in the group is being honest here that, well, I guess we have a couple that maybe have never had a estimating mistake or left something out of their bid, but really we see the bulk of the group is right there in the middle. So I'll give it just another second or two here, and we'll go ahead and we'll display these polling results. So real quick here, we'll put the results up there on the screen, and what you can see is, the bulk of it, we have had this happen every once in a while, and it's, by no fault of the estimator, no fault of the project manager. We get busy with things. Most of us have had multiple bids and been involved in multiple estimates, but sometimes we just forget, something simple in that estimate. But you'll see, as we go through the webinar today and go through this information, it's, some real simple things that we can do to ensure that we don't have these mistakes moving forward. The other thing, looking at question number 2, definitely glad to see that everybody has some type of a bid review process. And what you'll see in the presentation today is, really this is a process that we should be using on every job that we bid, no matter the size or type or how simple or how complex the job is. It's all about going through that process and making sure that we haven't left anything out of our estimate and that we have the most competitive bid that we can. Looking at the third question there, like I mentioned, having that checklist so that we can go through and make sure that we don't forget something in that bid or in our estimate definitely is something that's advantageous to the process. So as we look at the overall process of doing a bid review, is it really about the questions that we ask, or is it more about the answers that we're seeking in that bid review process? When we think about it, the answers are really the data and the information that we need or that we're trying to gather so that we can make the best decision possible with how we go to market with our bid. Of course, this is accomplished by asking good questions, but in order to ask the good questions, we must first ask ourselves, what is that information that we are seeking? So if we're looking at, that bid review and what is that information that we're seeking there, for some it's reassurance, it's a level of comfort, it's peace of mind. Maybe it's, looking at what are, potential mistakes or how we can avoid those mistakes. Or for some of us, we're busy doing other things, have an estimator that's doing, the takeoff and putting the estimate together. And it's just getting up to speed on what the project actually is that we're bidding. For some, it's bringing everybody on the same page. We're covering our bases, and then we start discussing that strategy of how we're going to bid that job. If you would, you can use the question and answer feature in Zoom and type in anything that, what are some of the other reasons that you and your company have bid reviews? Give it just a second here, see if there's any responses that are coming in there. Yeah, definitely. Have one person share risk is one of the things. It's identifying what those risks are and making sure that we have those covered in our estimate. Review to check our mistakes. Most definitely that's part of what this bid review process is, and we'll see real quickly here what some of those questions are that we can ask to make sure that we are looking at risk and that we are looking for those mistakes. One of the other important parts of that bid review process is who should be part of that bid review. For some companies they're smaller, that may be the estimator, project manager, and president of the company are all the same person. When we get into larger organizations, we may have multiple estimators working on the same project. We may have estimators that bid the job and then turn it over to project managers. So when we look at who's all involved in that bid review, we can quickly see, estimator or estimators, the project manager, maybe it's a general manager or division manager. Maybe it's the president or owner of the company. Maybe we want to bring in that general foreman that we see as being the one that will get the project built if we're successful. Maybe we want to involve our safety director, that there's additional safety requirements or certifications that we need to have on the project. Maybe it's a large enough project that there's going to be some cash flow concerns and we want to involve our CFO in that bidding and decision-making process there. Again, you can use the chat feature, the question and answer. Who are some of the other people that you've involved in the bid review process for your company? Well, maybe I had a pretty all-inclusive list there. I'm not seeing too many things come across. So the next question when we look at this is we've identified, what is the information we're seeking? Who should we have involved? But then, one of the other big questions is how long should this bid review take? Well, really the most simplest way to answer that question is as long as needed. There isn't a set, well, it should take 15 minutes or it should take an hour or it should take 4 hours. Typically the amount of time needed to have a thorough bid review should be proportional to the size and complexity of the project. And maybe it's even looking at how complete the bidding documents are and things like that. So there really isn't a set amount of time that it should take to do the bid review. But the one thing that I would say is, really strive to have that bid review if you can, at least 48 hours prior to the bid time. Because what we'll see is as we go through the bid review, again, we're asking questions, we're seeking information, but we'll also find that maybe we do have some holes that we need to fill and there's other information that we need to gather. So if we plan and have this bid review enough in advance, we can ensure that we do have adequate time to then go and gather that information, get that additional pricing, check some of those quotes that we have from our vendors, and bring everything back together and then have another review prior to sending our number out. So again, really not a set amount of time for each bid review. You're going to have to kind of judge that accordingly with the complexity and size of the job. But the most important part is making sure that we are doing the bid review and giving ourselves enough time to thoroughly review that and then make any changes or adjustments that we need to that come out of that bid review. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right into our list of 10 questions that we should be asking. But like we said, it's not necessarily the questions that we're asking. We need to be, more importantly, thinking about what are the answers that we're trying to seek with the questions that we ask. But the first question that we ask is, should we be bidding this project? And I know it might seem like it's a little late in the game to be asking this question, but really there is still time to pull the plug. It's a lot less expensive to absorb or eat the time that the estimator has spent putting together the estimate than it is bidding a job that we haven't had adequate time to evaluate and really have a good bid. I don't think anybody out there wants to bid a job knowing that we're going to lose money going into it. But when we ask this question, what we're really looking at is, has anything changed with the project? Do we have the necessary resources? Maybe when we first looked to bid the project, it was because maybe there was BIM on the project and maybe there was a completion date that we knew we could meet. Personal example of this is we were pursuing a hospital project that was in a rural area. BIM was required in the initial bid invitation. We knew that there wasn't any competition in that area that could do BIM, so we decided to bid that project. Well, in one of the addendums, they decided to remove that from the project requirements, and right there, that kind of eliminated some of our competitive advantage to that project, and we decided at that point that it was better to just roll up the drawings and not bid that because we couldn't really be competitive when it was only on price. The other thing is looking at the resources. Do we have the manpower? Do we have the financial resources? Is it something where we thought this project was, maybe $1 million project, but then all of a sudden as we get into it, it becomes a $3 or a $5 million project, and we really don't have the resources and the manpower to get that project completed. So again, it's never too late to pull the plug on the project, I guess, up until you submit that bid, and then it becomes a little bit more complicated with how we would walk away from that. The second question is, and this is probably one of the most important ones, is what is our scope of work? And it may sound simple, but one of the first questions to answer when we're looking at scope is, are we bidding this as a subcontractor or are we bidding this project as a prime contractor? Because that definitely changes what we're responsible for on that project. It's trying to identify what is the work that we will be doing. And if we're looking at it from the electrical standpoint, is it the electrical, the low voltage? On the low voltage, is it a complete system or is it rough in only? Are we doing the civil work, or is there going to be work done by others? So really we're trying to determine what is the work that we're going to be doing in-house, and then maybe identifying what is some of the work that we might need subcontractors for. The next question is, and again, it sounds pretty simple, but do we have a good takeoff? And it's, really what we're trying to get at here is everything covered. How thorough is the takeoff? Did we forget anything? What is the estimator's level of comfort there? This traditionally is that page turn that we do, making sure that everything's marked off the prints, the details, the notes, that there isn't anything that's uncertain with scales or something like that. But it's how adequately did we review those documents? And of course, technology is making this easier to do without everybody being in the same room. So if you have multiple locations, or now with trying to keep some social distance, technology allows us to do some screen shares and even do our takeoff on screen. But one of the most important things is what we have marked off, whether it was traditionally with the plans or now that we're using the on-screen takeoffs, that what we have marked off is truly reflected in the estimate and not just marked off to have it marked off on the screen. Continuing along, and this is something that was brought up when we were looking at what is one of the main reasons why we have our bid review. Have we found all the errors? And I think those of you that have bid multiple projects and been around estimating for a while realize that there are errors, there are in every one of the, sorry, got off there on the slides, that there are errors in every one of the takeoffs. And really what we need to do in this bid review process is make sure that we're finding and identifying those errors and making those corrections prior to bidding that job. And when we say, looking for these errors, it's looking for things, with the numbers, and do they make sense? Or do the quantities make sense? Are there any big numbers that maybe we fat fingered something when we input it? Instead of 1,000 foot of conduit, we have 10,000 foot of conduit. Or maybe it's looking at the little numbers where, it's the ones and twos, and should that have been a 10 or a 20? But we need to look at this not only on the quantities, but then the material and the labor. Make sure that we have the right multipliers in there for material. Is it something that's priced per each, per 100, per 1,000? And the same thing with the labor. Is it a labor unit per each, per 100, per 1,000? And that, really, do those numbers make sense with how we look at that estimate? And it's, maybe starting at that 30,000 foot view and looking at the whole estimate together, looking for those big glaring numbers. And then maybe we break it down to the next level and look, maybe it's label by label or area by area. And we say, okay, this makes sense for feeders and this makes sense for lighting. And then it's kind of going to that next level and looking at maybe the assemblies that we have in the takeoff. And, if we have parallel feeders, do we have the right number of conduits and the right number of conductors in those conduits? Or maybe when we look at the conduit, do we have the conduit, the supports, the couplings, the connectors, that we have all the parts and pieces that it's going to take to get that project done? So really, we're looking for numbers that we would say are outside the norm. And, at the end of the day, we're just asking ourselves, do these numbers make sense? And for some, junior or inexperienced estimators, this might be a little bit harder to do. And this is where we want to enlist some of those more senior estimators or some of the other people within our company that have some of that historical data, whether it's in their head or they have, some spreadsheets that kind of say, for this type of project, this is where we should be for, average foot of conduit per light fixture or average foot of conduit per fire alarm device. The next question is, are we missing any information? It's not so much, are there things missing in the takeoff, or there errors in the quantities that we have, but it's, are we missing any information? And did we get all of our RFIs answered? Are there any unknowns that we still have? And, through this bid review process, this would be a good time to maybe have that separate notepad. So as we're going through and people are asking questions and we're reviewing the project, that if something comes up that looks to be either a hole or maybe a gray area, that we would want to jot that down and make sure that we are getting those questions answered. So, how are we accounting for these items in our estimate of, maybe it's, we've asked the RFI and all the addendums have been presented, but it still hasn't answered the questions that we have. How are we going to account for that in our estimate? And, do we need to spell this out in our scope letter, or is it something that we can make an assumption that we can clearly define and that we can maybe attach some type of an allowance to and state that in our scope letter? And really it's looking at how do we provide as much detail that is necessary in our scope letter to clearly express what we're bidding. Similar to the amount of time needed to review the job, the length and complexity of our scope letter should be proportional to the completeness of the information that we have to bid the project. So maybe, for example, a design build project where we only have 50% design development prints, we'd probably need to have a little bit more detailed and extensive scope letter um, that we prepare to submit with our bid. And maybe it's even as detailed as bidding a school or bidding a hospital, where we go in and spell out exclusively, this is exactly what we're including for a typical classroom or for a typical operating room, that it's that level of detail because we didn't have that in the bidding documents. Again, continue to build on some of these previous questions is, have we covered all of our costs? Not only are we looking to make sure that we have a good takeoff, that we have all the information, but really this all starts coming into, what are the costs? What are the things that we need to get pricing on to put our estimate together? Of course, we look at the major categories that we have in any estimate, and that's, our material, labor, direct job expenses, overhead. But it's looking at, our standard material or the material that might be coming out of our database or the spreadsheet that we use. What are the things that we need to get quotes on? Looking at labor, is it straight time rates? Do we need to put in or factor overtime or shift pay? Are there any subcontractors that we should be getting prices from on this? But then looking at our direct job expenses or maybe the general conditions. What are some of the equipment rental that we might have? Storage. Are there any bonding requirements? Any permits that we have to have? And then looking at our overhead. How is that being applied to the job? Is it a percent of all the costs? Is it a percent of labor? Is it a flat dollar amount? But then most importantly, what is it that we're using as that multiplier for our overhead? But some of the other things that we need to make sure that we are looking at is, maybe there's allowances called out in the specifications, looking at things for non-productive labor, such as, stretch and flex or security, or now maybe some of the things around COVID. And as we get back onto job sites, some of the inefficiencies that we might have working with some of the required PPE. Any labor or wage increases, any escalation that you might be charged with from some of your suppliers, and then also looking at what are things that are maybe being furnished by others or being furnished by the owner that we still have to install. And I think one of the most important things is when we look at costs is we don't want to wait until the last minute to gather all this pricing that we need. The majority of the participants in the webinar are subcontractors. So just like the general contractor doesn't want to wait to get our number at the last minute, we shouldn't wait until the last minute to gather all the prices and costs that we need for our estimate. So it's reaching out to those subcontractors ahead of time and the suppliers ahead of time and trying to gather as much of that information as we can, so that when we are putting our bid together, really all we have to do is plug in, just as few of possible numbers as we can. When we think about this, what are some of those items that, we're typically waiting on that we could, get prices on ahead of time? And I know, vendor quotes tend to be the ones that we're waiting to the last minute, but we could even ask for, maybe it's a bill of material from the gear manufacturer, or reach out to the lighting rep and say, hey, are you bidding this package per plans and specs, or are these all approved fixtures, or are you providing alternate fixtures, where we could at least have some of that information ahead of time, so that when it comes down to receiving their actual quote, all we're doing is evaluating the price, and we don't have to try to fill in some of these holes to have this complete spec package. Yeah, one of the things that just popped up in the chat here is, yeah, definitely, is your sales tax rate correct for the job location? So for those of you that are bidding in multiple areas, sales tax is one of those things, making sure that you also know the labor. If you're signatory to multiple unions, maybe you have different labor agreements, but knowing which market you're in would affect both the sales tax as well as some of those labor costs. Looking at the next question here is, and this is again something that was brought out and why we have that bid review, but what are our risks and have we covered all of them? Looking at some of the potential risks, it's labor availability, productivity, things like that. Looking at it from a material standpoint, availability of material, lead times. As I've talked with some contractors in the last few weeks, the lead times is one of those wild cards right now, with some of these factories starting to ramp back up and starting to produce light fixtures, but what used to be a 6 to 8 week lead time is now anywhere from a 10 to 14, and at the most extremes, I've heard up to 16 weeks that we're waiting on some of these materials. So making sure that we understand that, how that fits into, things like the schedule and the completion date. Also tying into the schedule is looking at, who is the general contractor or the owner that we're working with, and will they be maintaining that schedule? Will there be possible overtime at the end of the job? Looking at something that really isn't anything we can control, but looking at the weather and what are some of the potential risks that are associated with weather. If we know that, being here in Nebraska, our winters can get pretty ugly. So if it's a project that's just coming out of the ground in November or December, the likelihood of us being able to put a lot of manpower on that project, other than maybe getting some underground in there, is going to be limited. Whereas if that project would have been coming out of the ground, in the spring or summer, by fall and winter, when it's starting to get cold out, it would probably be enclosed, and we can look at, how that might ramp up differently. Or, if we do outside work and we do traffic signal or we do distribution work, how does weather come into play with how we might schedule things and some of those risks that we have. And then some of the other unknowns are just, maybe underground conditions. What are some of the site conditions or existing conditions within a facility? Maybe other trades that are on that project, maybe who they are, who those subcontractors are that we might be working with. But there, a lot of different things that could fall into this unknowns category. But really, when we think about it, when we're looking at those risks, labor is probably the largest risk that any contractor has on a project. So we need to think about and ask the questions, what have we done to protect ourselves? And when we look at labor and we look at that as maybe our largest risk factor, it's making sure that we are covering that risk. And, the most simplest thing would be is if it's a multi-year project, making sure that we, have any labor increases. But really what we're looking at is, what is our productivity going to be on that project? We have our labor units in our estimating system, or we have some type of a database that we look at those labor units from, and we get a total number of hours at the, at the end when we put our estimate together. But we need to look and truly dive in and say, well, are we going to be able to get the project built for the man hours we have? Do we need to add man hours, or can we be a little bit more competitive and take some risk and maybe factor that down, and we only need 80% of those hours to get that project completed? But what we need to do is really take that step back and analyze the big picture and say, well, what are those potential labor risk factors that we have on the project? Maybe it's inefficiencies with working in a multi-story building, or it's a large space or a large footprint where maybe we need to look at ways to get our materials and get our manpower out to different places on the site. But it's looking and trying to identify what are all those factors that could potentially cause us to really go over on the man hours that we have in the project. Some of the other things that we may want to look at would be, liquidated damages, and maybe it's how we identify and clarify what our responsibility is with liquidated damages in our scope letter. An example that I use when I chat with contractors about liquidated damages and the importance of that is being here in Nebraska. Husker football is a pretty big thing. Maybe not so much the last few years. The team hasn't been that great. But when I was in contracting, we bid a project at the stadium when they were doing their expansion. And the liquidated damages on that project were $250,000 per home game that we went beyond the schedule. So of course, that's something that the general contractor is going to want to shift that risk onto the subcontractors, but we had to be real careful how we spelled that out in our scope letter to make sure that we weren't on the hook for any thing that wasn't in our control on that project. So whether it's with the labor and how we factor it, things like liquidated damages, but really it boils down to how do we put this into our scope letter of You know, maybe we are only working a normal schedule, an 8 to 5 schedule, that there isn't any overtime, that we aren't going to participate in any liquidated damages other than damages caused by our own negligence. And really, when we look at risk, you know, not only do we want to try to minimize that as much as we can, but the one thing that we should keep in the back of our mind is you know, profit really should be proportional to the amount of risk that we are assuming on that project. So, you know, the more risk that we assume, the more profit that we should have on that project. When we, you know, start talking about profit, you know, one of the things is can we make money on this project? And, you know, really this boils down to looking at what are the profit goals for the company. And, you know, it's not so much that we just want to cover our costs, but we're all in business to make profit. That's what allows us to grow and expand and, you know, weather the storm when we have things like COVID, that we have workforce sitting and projects shut down. But sometimes we, you know, might be okay with taking less profit than normal on a project. Maybe it's because of seasonal work that we want to keep certain crews intact, or we want to keep some of our key people working. That maybe it's to keep some of our competition out of a specific facility that we've been in, or maybe it's as we expand into a new market that we want to be, you know, a little bit more competitive and try to get our foot in the door to some of those things. But one of the potential risks that we have is that we will potentially fill our bucket with what I would call cheap work, and then not have the resources for those more profitable projects. We want to make sure that we are real careful if we take this approach to, you know, not bidding at that profit level that we, you know that we need, or that we have as expectations for the company. And this is one of those things that I see time and time again as I've traveled around the country working with contractors. That it's real easy to fall into the mindset of, well, I need to bid the market. You know, that's a losing proposition from the get-go, that if you start bidding the market, then you start dropping to that level of your competition that doesn't know what they're doing and probably shouldn't even be in contracting. That as a contractor, we still have certain costs that we have to maintain. We have, you know, to buy the material, pay our workforce. We have a certain overhead that we have to cover. That, you know, when it boils down to it, profit's really that only flexible piece that we have. But we need to be real careful with how that is. If we start taking on too much work without any profit or the necessary profit margins, it can have long-term effects that we may not see right away. But you know, one of the questions that we could ask with this is, you know, really, why are we bidding this project? And that's probably one of those questions we would ask if we are looking at maybe not maintaining that specified profit level that we have for the company. And is it, you know, that we're trying to get this project to keep people busy, or, you know, is it that we're trying to keep that competition out of that facility? But it's a little bit more strategic than just, hey, we know the market is only bearing this amount of markup. Well, then maybe it's time to look into a different niche of where you're competing, or maybe a different type of project where you have less competition. Again, you know, along those lines of profitability, we need to look at, you know, is our price competitive? And, you know, when we start looking at this and we look at profitability, we start talking about our competition. You know, maybe it's keeping people out. We want to lower our profit a little bit there. But the other thing is as we look at our competition, look at the marketplace, you know, I would say the time where you may bid the market is when you know your competition's bucket's full and they're not going to be as aggressive on that project. Or maybe it's you and one other bidder on there, that it might allow you to have a little bit more leeway with how much markup you put on there. Now, I'm not saying that you need to hit a home run on every project, but it's being aware of really what that marketplace looks like, and make sure that you are maximizing your profit potential on each price, or on each project. You know, the other thing with that is asking the questions along the line of, are we competing, you know, on price alone, or is it the value that we bring to the project? You And is it necessarily that the low price is the best price, in the market? And, are we bidding this job to get it, or are we bidding this job to make money? And I think that's one of the things where, again, it's looking at bidding the market versus bidding the project. But then knowing some of those other outside factors that maybe allow us to be a little bit more competitive, allow us to get a little bit more money into that bid, especially if we start competing on value, not so much just on the low price. And what it comes down to is, would you rather get the job and lose money, or not get the job because you had all your costs covered? And I think this is, one of those things that, as contractors, we want to make sure we have enough, backlog, that we have projects that we're billing, we have the cash coming in the door. But really, if we get these cheap projects, or the projects without any profit in them, really it's not a whole lot different than taking that job and losing money, that we need 3, 4, 5, maybe even 10 other projects to really get us dug out of that hole. So we want to keep that in mind. And, do we want to be the low number, or do we want to have the right number? And I think that's one of those, if we look at that and answer that question, that we go into each one of these bids saying, hey, we know this is what it takes our company to do this job, and we're happy with that. And that leads me right into the last question we have is, can we live with our bid? And really what this boils down to, are we comfortable with the number that we have to submit as our bid? Is it the comfort level? Will we make money if we are awarded this project? And it kind of comes down to, are we okay with not winning the bid just as much as, if we are okay with getting the bid? And like I said before, we know our costs, we know we can't do it for less than that. So we need to keep that in mind, and not get too hung up on bidding the market and bringing our number down just to get the work. That we need to say that we had the right number, and maybe that number that was less than ours is the wrong number. Now, I would also say that it's important to make sure that if we bid a project and our competition is 20% lower than us, that maybe we would want to reevaluate and see what it would take to get our number down there, and see if maybe we did have an error or mistake that we missed in our bid review process. But I would also caution you that, it's a lot better that if we have 4 or 5 bidders, to kind of see where the bulk of the bidders are, see where you stack up against, the same competition time and time again. That we don't want to make knee-jerk, reactions to one project where somebody was quite a bit lower than where we are. And again, I think it's just being okay with not winning the bid. That, like we said, back to that very first question we had up there of, should we bid this project or not? It's kind of in that same mindset of, hey, we're going to bid this project. We know what our costs are. We know what we want to make, but at the same time, we don't want to do it for any less than that. So I think that's one of those things, that it's asking those questions. And it's not so much a question maybe that we had asked to the whole group in the bid review, but as the owners of the company, or some of the more senior people in the company, it really starts playing into that overall bidding strategy that we have. Just looking at a couple of the questions that are coming up here. Sure. So Joseph asked the question, does electrical costs allow for a general rule like 10% for electrical of the whole job budget? Do not bid the job just to try to get the job. So I think with the first part there is, that I've heard that as a rule of thumb for a number of years. I would say, Joseph, and anybody else that has that same question, what I would do is kind of track that over time and have that dialogue with contractors, or with the general contractors, because I've seen on some that, that 10% is pretty loose rule of thumb. but I've seen it as much as where the electrical, when you bring in all the low voltage systems, being as much as 30% of the total project. So I think, maybe as a rule of thumb, that's an okay number to go with. But I would also say, maybe you should track it on commercial work, industrial work, new construction versus remodel, and then look at it. Really, we need to compare scope to scope, just like we would if we were putting together a square foot budget. We wouldn't want to use square foot data that is only the electrical portion if we had to provide the fire alarm and the voice data and security. We want to make sure that we are comparing apples to apples. But yes, I would say that 10% is a good loose rule of thumb. And then I think the next part there was just your comment is, yeah, definitely not bidding the job just to get the job, that we want to make sure that we're bidding it not only to get it, but that at the same time we can make money when we're doing that. So real quick, here's just the rundown of the top 10 questions that we would ask in every one of our bid reviews. And when we think about it is, putting this into some type of a checklist, and it doesn't have to be anything complicated or complex. It can just be a simple Word document that these are the questions that we want to ask, or an Excel spreadsheet that you can check off as you ask those. But the more important part is that we are going through this process, and that we're using this process on each and every project that we're bidding, no matter how small or simple it is. That really we all have a lot on our plates, and we have a lot of different distractions throughout the day. And I would even say, if you are the estimator and project manager, I would even have a checklist like this that you go through yourself. One of the things that we did when I was in contracting is, even if we were the one that was responsible for everything with that estimate and turning that number out, we would go through that checklist just for our own peace of mind that we had everything accounted for. And I put this up here and a little bit of humor in here. But a lot of people think that these questions are common sense, and the whole idea of having this bid review is common sense. But then I ask the question is, if it is truly common sense, then why do we still make mistakes, and we have these errors, and we have these gaps, in our estimate, that really it boils down to is we're busy. We're pulled in a lot of different directions, that we get, like Joseph said there, we rush to get the bids out, that we don't take that time to make sure that we have, all the information that we need. And, really the goal, back to what we started with of that bid review, is that it's more about those answers that we seek than the actual questions that we ask. And that we're trying to seek that data and that information to make the best known decision we can about something unknown. And that unknown is we have to go and build this project. And right now we have to price that without even knowing all the different factors of labor productivity. What are some of the things that might come up? But, those of you that had a project that started in January or February of this year, I would venture to guess that project complexion has changed drastically from how you bid that project to what you're seeing now for productivity and some of the added costs with PPE. Just looking here again at some of the questions, and I guess that's where my next slide leads is, those of you that do have questions, I'm going to try to read through the list here. You can submit them in the chat, or if you want to submit them with the question and answer, or if some of you would like to ask them live, raise your hand and I will unmute you, and we can have a little bit of a dialogue there. But let's see here. One of the questions is, yeah, so Stan said here, one of the questions we could ask is, what would not bidding the job do to our relationship with the client? And, is there a way to bid without winning, but making sure that we serve them? And I think, Stan, I think that's spot on. And I would venture to guess that almost all of us have, had a scenario where it's an owner or general contractor that we've done work with in the past, and maybe we don't have the resources to get that job done, but we want to stay in their good graces and be asked to that next one. So I think that the important thing is putting together a solid estimate, but we don't want to just add another zero to the end of it and say, well, here's your bid. We still need to make it look like we took some time and put some effort towards getting that estimate put together, because they are reaching out to us as a partner, that they want our input. And maybe part of that is hey, we'll give you a number that tells you the range that it should be in, but we just don't have the resources right now. But if you really want us to do this job, can you delay it 3 months or 6 months, and then we would have the resources and the manpower to do that. Yeah, and one of the other comments here is, less and less time to do the estimates, and the projects that we have, tend to move quicker. That, sometimes and Joseph said here, you only have 2 days to estimate the project, and it's very hard to do. And I think, that's one of the things is it boils down to the business decisions that play into our bidding strategy. And it's looking at, kind of to Stan's point, why are we bidding this, and are we better off not bidding this? But how does that affect that relationship with these others? And those are some of those hard decisions that we have to make of, do we have enough time and resources to truly have a good estimate, or are we just, throwing a number out the door? And I think to that same point, it's looking at this bid review. If we're going to put the resources of the company behind getting this project, for whatever strategic reason that is, then part of that process should be having this bid review and making sure that we are covering all of our costs, and that we're identifying and analyzing our risk. That the bid review process is just as important as it is getting an accurate count on those light fixtures. That at the end of the day, we want that peace of mind. We want to make sure that we have the best number out there, that not only can we get that project if that's what we're trying to do, but most importantly, that we can make money on that project as well. So the question here is, do you have an idea of what percentage of overhead is for the average electrical contractor? Aaron, I would say, that's going to vary a lot on size of contractors. I've worked with some small contractors that they just operate out of what I would call like a service van from their home. So their overhead expense is going to be a lot lower than maybe a larger contractor, or not even a larger, but somebody that's a little bit more established, that has a storefront and they have additional staff. But I think that's going to be something where you're going to need to look at maybe what is that overhead, and really challenge you to try to keep it down as low as you possibly can, because that's one of those added costs that we have, a cost of doing business. But it can really affect our competitiveness on a job. Where I've seen contractors run into problems with that is they get their, maybe they get their office staff a little too large before they're ready for it, and they get some great people on their team, but maybe they're a little bit higher paid individuals that really haven't proven themselves yet. Or one of the worst case scenarios is somebody goes out and thinks they need to buy, these brand new fancy trucks, where maybe a used one would do the job. That when we start looking at it, there's a lot of times we can be profitable on paper, but if we don't have the cash coming in the door to help pay for some of these things, we can really get our overhead inflated real quick, and lessen our competitiveness on a project. Any other questions or comments? Like I said, if any of you have, oh, here we got one coming in. Sure. So I guess the question here is back to the whole, when maybe we don't want to bid the project, but we want to stay, I would say, in the good graces of that client. So what would be the best way to notify the client that we will not be bidding the project? Don't want to tell them that it won't fit into our schedule because we don't want them to not send us future invites. Yeah, I think, Nick, one of the biggest things that I would say there is really it's being honest and open with that client, and say, we really appreciate the opportunity, but we also have a certain level of service that we like to provide to our customers. And if we take on this project right now, we really won't be able to provide that same level of service that you've come to expect from us on these previous projects that you've done. That, you know, maybe there's some things that we could do right now to at least get this started, or, maybe allocate a man or two to that project, but we really can't take on the whole project right now. But just have that dialogue and that communication with them. And I'd say that's probably more so if you're dealing directly with that owner. If it's just a public bid that has a bid date and this is when the schedule is, it might be a little bit more difficult to have that conversation then. Hopefully that answered your question there, or at least gave you some food for thought. Any other questions? All right, so one of the questions here is, what is the market standard for marking up travel expenses? And I guess, Seth, the easiest way to answer that is I would say mark it up whatever you can get away with. I've seen, anywhere from just passing the travel expenses straight through, to just using the same markups that you would for any other expense that you have on that project. Whether it's reproducing drawings, it's renting, tools and equipment, that those travel expenses are really no different than any other expense on that project. So again, I think that's going to be something where you would have to weigh that with, I guess, how does that make you more or less competitive in the marketplace by how you would mark up those expenses. Ooh, okay. So Stan's hitting hard today with the questions here. So the question is, do you have any thoughts on using abstract or non-conventional ways to review the estimate, which might uncover errors? And boy, I guess, Stan, do you have a microphone on your end there? If you raise your hand, let's have a little bit of a dialogue here, so I for sure understand what the question is that you're asking, and don't make any assumptions. But if you would raise your hand, and I'll unmute you, and we can kind of see what you're looking for there when what you say are abstract or non-conventional ways in which you might uncover errors. Oh, so I guess no microphone there. So I guess, Stan, let's put it back this way, and maybe we put it to the whole group. What in your mind would be these abstract or non-conventional ways? I guess I've kind of have a process that I go through, and maybe to some it's non-conventional or abstract, but I'm pretty linear in my thinking, and this is the process that I go through. Are there some things that you've done in the past? Oh, taking data out of the estimating program, and what would you do with that data then once you had it out of the estimating program? Okay, so maybe instead of just looking at the numbers, it's looking at it in graphical ways, comparing it to other metrics. Sure, and I would say, that's where having that library of some historical information that you could check against, looking at McCormick, they have some graphs within their system where you can look at labor hours and check those against typical projects. One of the things that I used all the time was looking at the graph of what I called the top sheet, or the summary sheet, and then I could start looking at my ratios of material and labor on typical projects. And really that's, looking at that 30,000 foot view to say, okay, yeah, this project makes sense based on the last 5 that we've done. And we found that, healthcare to healthcare, commercial to commercial, school to school, that a lot of those ratios look similar. Yeah, rechecking your costs for material and labor. Yeah, just because the computer spit out a number doesn't necessarily mean that that number is right, that we want to make sure that we have the right information in there. Another question, what are some of the estimating or construction software platforms that you would consider essential? You know, Nick, I think the most important thing is having a software or application or whatever that platform is, it's having the mindset that that's just another tool to make us that much more efficient in how we do our job. But I would say, if you're looking at getting into things, estimating is probably one of the most important software pieces or platforms that you would do, and making sure you have a good accounting system. I think a lot of people want to rush out and subscribe to an app or go out and buy software just because it's for project management, it's for safety management. I think there's a lot of great tools out there, but it still has to fit into what you're doing, and that it makes the most sense for you and your company. But I would say, having a solid estimating system, having a solid accounting system, some type of a means to track the progress on that job. But then you can start adding in some of those additional layers with, project management, safety management, a CRM system, some of those things as you find they're needed. Another question here. Yeah, just like Joseph said here, software doesn't make a good estimate without a good estimator. And really, Joseph, you hit the nail on the head there. It's making sure that, the estimator knows what they need to pull out of those drawings and specifications and get that information into the estimating system. If we think about it, any estimating software that's out there, or even any accounting software, we could do all of it with paper and pencil, but it just makes us that much more efficient. But we have to be able to tell it what information or put the right information into that system to get the right information out. So have time for a couple more questions here if anybody has those. Hopefully, Nick, you didn't feel I was passing the buck there a little bit and answered your question. But yeah, I do have time for a couple more questions here if anybody has those. As I'm waiting for those to come in, I would like to thank McCormick Systems again for sponsoring our webinar today. Feel free to reach out to them, visit their website at mccormicksys.com. Love for you to reach out to us directly. You can see here on the screen our web address, our phone number. You can email me at mdf@firestonecg.com or just at our general mailbox, info@firestonecg.com. But I guess without seeing any other questions, I'll hold tight for just a minute longer here and see if anything comes through. But would definitely like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Do apologize. We wanted to have this webinar last week, and the last Wednesday crept up on me a little bit quicker than I was anticipating, but we will be looking to have another webinar here at the end of July as well. So stay tuned to your email. And yeah, thanks, Joseph. Yeah, definitely no shaking hands anymore. I need to do maybe find a picture of an elbow bump or something like that. So, well, I appreciate everybody's time today. And again, thank you for participating in the webinar, and keep an eye out in your inbox. I will be sending you a link to the recording of this webinar as well as the slides from today's webinar. So with that, have a great rest of your week, and we look forward to seeing all of you at future webinars.